Well, good evening to you all, and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK, and as ever, wherever you are in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Richard Charkin, and I'll introduce Richard to you in just a moment. A little housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. We'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. There's also a chat facility which you can use if you want to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar. And finally, we are recording this event. It will be available on our website at milim.org.uk in the next day or so. You will find recordings of other past events there, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest, Richard Charkin has worked in publishing for more than 50 years, giving him a unique range of experiences. He's been a scientific and medical publisher, a journal publisher, a digital publisher, and a general publisher, working for family-owned companies, public companies, and startups. He's the author of this book, My Back Pages, an undeniably personal history of publishing, 1972 to 2022. He joins us from France this evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome him to Milim. Richard, wonderful to have you with us.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and great to be here. As the light fades here in France, and we're an hour later than you are, of course. But,
of course. So we're going to talk about all things publishing, and I suppose the first question everybody will be wondering is, what made you want to get into publishing in the first place?
Okay, imagine 1971, if you can. I just left university. A friend of mine managed to persuade the Sunday Times to fund me to go to America to write a piece about pollution in Utah, in the state of Utah. I wrote it and submitted it, and they published it, and they paid me £10. I rang up the editor and said, look, that took me 3 months. £10 for 3 months' work, it's not great. And he said, yeah, you're not a member of the National Union of Journalists. If you were, we'd pay you better. So I said, well, how do I get to be a member of the National Union of Journalists? And he said, well, you can write another 6 like that, or get into publishing. They're desperate for new members. So didn't really want to go into publishing. I wanted to be a journalist. But I wrote off to, I think, 30 publishers in London. I got 3 interviews, one with Hodder and Stoughton, who told me not to bother, one with Collins, who told me not to bother, and then the third one, a company called Harrop, obviously desperate, hired me on £1,200 a year. That's how I started. I don't think I really meant to stay there very long, but I stayed so far 52 years, a long time.
Which has been an illustrious time for you. You've written this book, which is a wonderful read. Was there something particular that made you want to write a book about your experiences?
Okay, here's the truth. The truth is always good, I think. I lecture at various of these publishing courses in universities around the UK, and I just tell stories. And several of the people running the courses said, well, why don't you write it down? And I say, well, the world does not need another self-serving publishing autobiography. And anyway, I'm too old and I can't remember the truth. In fact, I know almost nothing. So I won't do it. And then family friend who writes novels but had a bit of a gap in his thing said, I'll help you. And it's called Tom Campbell. And Tom and I sat down and I told the stories and he made some notes and we wrote it, and suddenly it became easy to write. So I think I didn't really mean to do it, but having started something, you've got to finish it. And after a few of these sessions, we found we had 60 or 70,000 words, which is a book. At which point, we still didn't know whether we'd publish it. But I wanted to send it to some experts because I didn't want it to be wrong. Whatever it was, I wanted to check. So I sent it to experts. One of the experts, who's really the sort of founder of book metadata, bibliographic information, said he didn't know whether the metadata chapter was correct, but he'd love to publish it because he'd set up a publishing company. So I said, okay. So that's how it happened. And that was in March. We published in April in time for the London Book Fair. And I was nervous as hell. It's strange being an author. I've known it's a different thing than being a publisher. I've learned a lot. So that's how it came about. And I couldn't be happier with the reaction and just about everything about it.
This is interesting because you've now told me in the space of 5 minutes that your journey into publishing was an accident, and publishing the book was an accident. And in fact, you write in the book about some very interesting accidents, which I think we'll hopefully talk about a bit later. Yeah. But when the book opens, you highlight very early on how dramatically things had changed. I think you compare your sort of first day at work to your last day employed by a publisher, and I just think it would be useful to set the scene if you told our audience how things have changed over those 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, in the writing of the book, I imagine this is true in any book. You think about longer periods of time than the normal life, and so I think a few trends came through. Like when I started, effectively there were no women in senior management in the industry. Now I think something like 70% of senior director jobs are held by women. So 0 to 70%, quite a huge shift. And it wasn't just that they weren't in the senior jobs. It was assumed that men would be running the businesses and making the key decisions, and women by and large would come in as assistants or maybe copy editors or something like that, but not at the higher level. So that's one area. The second area clearly is technology. When I started my first job, if you wanted to know the sales figures of a book, you would go to the production director or department and say, how many did we print? And then you'd go to the publicity department and say, how many did we give away? And finally, you would go to the warehouse and say, how many have we got left? And via relatively simple arithmetic, you arrived at a sales figure. There were no computers. We had the warehouse in this company. It was called Harrop, and it was in High Holborn, the whole company, including the warehouse. And booksellers would drive to the building in High Holborn to collect books. Obviously, we also sent them to other places, but there was a thing called a trade counter. There'd be a guy there with a little invoicing pad with something called carbon paper. He'd write out the invoice and keep a carbon copy. It was a very different world. We all smoked. I particularly was quite a heavy smoker. We drank at lunchtime. We'd play snooker at lunchtime, table tennis, sometimes into the afternoon. The local pub was the Princess Louise, which is still going in High Holborn. And there was a public bar and a saloon bar. The workers went in the public bar and drank beer. The management went in the saloon bar and drank gin and tonics. My position was not really very clear, because I was clearly a worker, so I belonged, and indeed I was in the trade union, and indeed father of the chapel of the union. So I really was meant to be in the public bar, but somehow or other, probably because I have a degree and all that sort of thing, I ended up sometimes in the saloon bar. So I was a bit ambivalent, and so were they. It was a different world. It seems trivial, but it's not really. The government had wage restraint to try to stop inflation. There was very high inflation. And the government said you aren't allowed to give people pay rises. Sometimes companies wanted to give a pay rise to keep someone in the company, so they'd give you a company car. So at the age of 23, I had a company car. It was a terrible car. It was a Morris Marina, one of the worst cars the UK car industry ever made. But nonetheless, it was a car. And I think maybe in this small company, probably half the people had a company car. And now, of course, it's hardly anyone has a company car. Other changes from an industry point of view, when I started, you could guarantee an average novel, not a bestseller, and not a complete dog, something in between, would sell around 3,000 copies to public libraries, and then extra sales. That 3,000 copies pretty well covered your costs. Now, public libraries have been decimated, and I mean that literally. 1 in 10, the budget for buying books is about 10% in real terms of what it was 50 years ago, which is a tragedy, and I think socially irresponsible of various governments and local authorities who have overseen it. But anyway, that's by the way. The damage that does to the not best-selling author is huge, and we see it every day. And in starting my own business, I get offered so many books from people who in the old days would have made a decent living out of writing a book a year, a novel a year. That's a big change. So does that answer your question, Jonathan?
I think so. It's fascinating, and of course you describe this in much greater detail in the book. But you didn't stay at Harrop very long. Quite quickly, you move on to the Oxford University Press, which was no.
You missed us. There was a misstep there.
Okay,
if I may.
Of course.
So I was there for about 2.5 years. And because of this wage restraint, you either had to move if you wanted to make some more money. And at this point, I had my first child, and we couldn't really afford to live. So decided that we'd move out of London, where it was slightly more affordable. And I hunted for a job, and I got a job at a company called Pergamon Press. Pergamon Press was owned by someone called Robert Maxwell, who some of you may have heard of. He was Czech, born a Czech, and actually, irritatingly, in the Dictionary of National Biography, the first line is he was born in number 1 Synagogue Street in Prague, which was sending some sort of message, I think. Anyway, he came to England via Germany, and he really created modern scientific publishing. Anyway, I got a job there, and I happened to bump into him on my first day, this huge, very powerful guy. And he sort of took me under his wing to some extent, which was not a very comfortable position to be in under his wing, but nonetheless, I learned a hell of a lot about business, about publishing. I fell out with him in due course because he was running as a Labour candidate in the general election for Buckingham constituency. And he instructed everyone in the company, to turn up and get on coaches from Oxford, which would take them to Buckingham, where we could canvass on his behalf. I was father of the Chapel of the Union, and so my duty was to tell him that it was perfectly okay for people to canvass on his behalf, but he could not make that compulsory. And he said something like, "Richard, I thought you had a good career here. You'd better grow up before you..." Anyway, so that was the beginning of the end of my career at Pergamon, which fortunately lasted less than a year, but it was a great education in many respects.
And must have been a very interesting man to work for.
Interesting is the right word. Difficult, interesting, bullying, brilliant. And one shouldn't, I mean, you know, everything he did thereafter, not everything, but quite a lot was very, 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 very bad. But equally, he was a brilliant publisher.
We then get to the Oxford University Press,
okay.
which publisher of the Oxford English Dictionary, and you share some very interesting facts about particularly the first edition of the dictionary, which I'm sure our audience will be fascinated to hear.
Yeah. So where do I start?
Of course, you were working on the second edition, weren't you?
Well, the first edition started at Mill Hill School, and I think it was originally called the New English Dictionary. Of course, so like with many, many, many great editorial projects, it ran into trouble, started running out of money, and eventually Oxford stepped in, and it was finished in 1928. I think it took 60 years or 50, anyway, a very long time. It's finished in 1928. In 1931, they realized that they had to do a supplementary volume because of all the words that had come into the English language, or different meanings or subtle nuances. So they added a supplementary volume in 1930 or 31. And then in 1957, they started again addressing everything, and they produced over the next 30 years, 25 years, 4 additional supplementary volumes. I was then put in charge of dictionaries at Oxford, reference books in general. And it was clear that this mammoth and very important bit of scholarship was unusable. You had the original 13 volumes, then you had the supplement, and then you had the 4 volumes, and no scholar could ever pull it all together. And also that at the time, copyright ran out in 50 years. So that in 1978, we were going to lose our monopoly, if you like, on those very original words, unless we did something. And what we did was to digitize. We didn't know the word digitize, incidentally. We said computerize, if I remember rightly. We rekeyed the whole of the OED, plus the supplement, plus the 4 supplements. And then we had to write software to integrate those words and meanings. And at one level, that sounds simple. At another level, it's incredibly difficult. But we did it with the help of, first of all, Mrs. Thatcher, who managed to persuade the Department of Trade and Industry to give us a subsidy of £350,000, which was not a huge amount even then, but it was enough to give us some credibility. And we were able to take that to IBM, who then gave us 2 million, plus one of their genius software writers. And that allowed us to approach the University of Waterloo in Canada, who at the time were the best computer campuses in the world. They invented the BlackBerry, incidentally, for those of you who remember the BlackBerry. And they helped us write some of the software. We pulled together a scholarly group, which included Umberto Eco, Philip Larkin, I can't remember who else, a few other sort of grandees. And this started in 1981, I think. And we finished it in 1988, and it was published in 1989, and is now the world's leading digital project in English scholarship, I think. It was terrifically exciting. And I went back to OUP, God bless them, invited me to give a talk to their staff about my book and about those days. And it was clear that not only had we digitized this great megalith, if you like, but actually we had allowed OUP to build expertise in computer technology, which most publishers didn't have. And that's seen them well, and they were saying, and I'm pleased they said it, to this day. And OUP is now, when I joined OUP, we were losing money. We exceeded our debt limit with Barclays Bank at one stage. It's hard to imagine now. And now I just saw their annual report. Their sales are just short of £1 billion, and they made over 120 million to the University of Oxford. It's a very significant part of Oxford's income now. So it's done okay, and I'm very proud of everything there.
Now, interestingly, you touched on copyright, and you said at the time it lasted 50 years. It was changed, I think, in 1995 to 70 years. Did that have a big impact on publishing? And also, you talk about some situations where there's a perpetual copyright. So how does that work?
I'll take the perpetual copyright first, if I may. It's bizarre. King James decided, King James, is that the second? Anyway, the King James Bible. King James decided that it should be protected in perpetuity. And only 3 publishers were allowed to publish it in England. That was Oxford, Cambridge, and Aaron Spottiswoode, who were the King's printers at the time. And that copyright remains perpetual. Unfortunately or fortunately, it only applies in England. So in Scotland, you can do, anyone can do the Bible, and in America and everywhere else. So it's only in England, and not that many Bibles get sold anymore. So it's no big deal. But that was a perpetual copyright. And there was another one, just one book called Clarendon's History of the Rebellion that no one ever buys. And for some reason that was granted perpetual copyright. I have no idea why. But on the more general thing of whether the change from 50 years after the death of the author to 70 years, I think it's had enormous impact. I don't know whether any of your people here read about publishers buying each other, and they do all the time, and they fetch very high prices. Publishing isn't particularly profitable, and yet the prices people pay for publishing assets are very high. And the reason is that, I mean, if you take an obvious case, like J.K. Rowling. Bloomsbury published her, and they have the rights to publish her for term of copyright in various territories. Well, let's hope that she lives for another 30 years, which is completely feasible. And then copyright kicks in another 70 years. So they've effectively got a monopoly on that asset for 100 years. Before the change, it was only 80 years. So we've added, I don't know what that is, 20% to the value of the publishing company. So yes, I think it is an amazingly important thing. Of course, copyright is being challenged every day, every way. Artificial intelligence being the latest threat. Google challenged it in various times. And there are lots of people who think that it's a bad thing. Why shouldn't information be free? Why shouldn't people be able to read whatever they want to read without paying for it? I would take a different view, which is without copyright, people wouldn't bother to be creative, or at least they'd be less creative. And I think it's a genuine good for society.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, one of the other characters you were involved with was Paul Hamlyn. What can you tell us about him?
I mean, Paul's one of the loveliest, most menschlich people I've come across in my career. I first met him when I was at OUP, and we were broke, and we were looking for any source of income. And I was introduced to him, and we did a deal whereby he would reissue some of our really bad-selling old books, jazz them up, and could take them to the mass market. Which was his skill. He started with classical music. I think it was called Music for Pleasure, was his first big thing, where he made high-quality classical music available at very low prices, and was able to do that by getting lots of volume. So we did. So I managed to do this deal with him where we licensed him a few old books. And I remember in his office, he had very posh offices in Grosvenor Street. And I remember sitting there, and he said, "Well, what royalty should I pay you? What percentage?" And I hadn't prepared at all for this, so I guessed, and I said 20%. And he literally fell off his chair, rolled around on the floor, and said, "I'll offer you 5." And I think we settled at 7. But anyway, that was my first meeting with him, and he had his offices were in London, but he had a place in Gloucestershire, a country house, and he had a Bentley. And he used to drive on Friday evenings from London to Gloucestershire. But being of a certain age, roughly halfway down the journey, he needed to stop for a pee. And he decided that my office at OUP was exactly halfway between London and Gloucestershire. So he would stop off and have the most disgusting cup of coffee from a machine and have a pee, and we talked. So we got to know each other very well. And then when I was about to leave OUP, because I didn't get the top job, and you either sulk or you get out. So I decided to get out. I rang him up one Friday evening and said, "Paul, you've been coming to see me all this time. I can't help feeling you'd quite like to hire me. And if you do, now is the time." And he said, "Oh, yes, okay. You're hired." I said, "But," he said, "but I can't, I'm no longer executive, so I'll have to tell my executive to follow up on Monday, and don't worry, it'll be fine." So I took him at his word, because I trusted him. He is a decent person, was decent person. So I then proceeded to resign to the only person who I could find to resign to on a Friday afternoon, because my boss had gone away for the weekend and my boss's boss had gone away for the weekend. The Vice Chancellor of the University of Oxford, a man called Patrick Neal, who was a very distinguished lawyer. And I knocked on his door tentatively and he was there. And I went in and he said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I've come to resign because I didn't get the top job and I don't want to sulk. I'd rather resign, and so I'm resigning." He said, "Oh, well, you know, you've got a young family. Do you have another job to go to?" And I said, "Well, yes, I do. Paul Hamlin said that he'd have a job for me." And Patrick Neal said, "But do you have that in writing?" I said, "No, I don't." And he said, "Well, can you trust this man? Isn't he a barrow boy?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, but I trust him more than I trust the University of Oxford," at which point I think my career there came to an abrupt end. So, and then I went to work with Paul, who was just a joy to work with. He has that combination of cultural integrity and commercial integrity. The two can go together. They often don't, but in his case, they came together. And he was the most marvelous person to work with. When I first started working with him, it was during the days of, do you remember the Spycatcher affair? A man called Peter Wright, who'd been a British spy, wrote his memoir. And Mrs. Thatcher, decided that it should be banned. And it was banned in the UK, but it was published by Heinemann, which is where we were. And Paul said, "Well, fuck this." Sorry. Paul said, "We're going to publish this, and to hell with Mrs. Thatcher." And so we published it from Australia, because she didn't have jurisdiction, whatever she might think, over Australia. We hired a bunch of Australians in Earl's Court to pretend to be in Sydney and rang up booksellers saying, "Would you like copies of this book?" And the book went on to sell 4 or 5 million copies. I think if she hadn't banned it, we'd have been lucky to sell 1,000. So she's one of the great marketing directors in publishing, I think. So Paul was a great man, and ever fond of him.
Now, a fellow called Tom Bower, he's still writing biographies.
Yeah.
You worked with him on a couple of books, not without some controversy. What can you share?
Well, 2 particular ones. One was he did a biography of Robert Maxwell, who you mentioned earlier. And just before publication day, I got a phone call from my boss, who was the head of Reed International, which is a big conglomerate publishing company. It owned IPC, which owned, you know, TV Times and Woman's Own and many magazines. Anyway, my boss rang me and said, "I've just taken a call from Robert Maxwell. His British Printing Corporation print all our magazines. And he said, if we go ahead with the publication of Tom Bower's book, none of the magazines will appear, which will lose the company a very large amount of money, because the advertisers wouldn't pay for the adverts if the magazine wasn't, and we wouldn't be able to collect subscription revenue." So he said, "I'll leave it to you, Richard, to decide whether you think it's a good idea to go ahead with this biography or not," which was slightly, anyway. We decided to postpone publication, and then Maxwell, fortunately for us, fell off the back of the boat, and we then reissued it immediately. The second one was Muhammad al-Fayed, who at the time owned Harrods, and Tom wrote this really good biography of him. during the course of production, Al Fayed invited me up to Harrods, walked me through Harrods and said, my dear boy, I think you should let me have a look at this biography to make sure it's thoroughly accurate, would only be right. And if you could let me see the manuscript, just look around the shop here. There are many things you might like to take home for your wife or anyone. And so that would be all right. Anyway, I said no. And he kept badgering me. And I kept saying no. Eventually, an advanced copy arrives. So it's too late to make any changes. So I arranged for a courier to take up a copy and said, please hand it personally to Mr. Fayed with my compliments. He's been dying to read it. The courier came back, I think 20 minutes later with the copy in his hand still, saying, Mr. Al Fayed sends his regards and suggests you use this book to wipe your arse. It's very kind of him. So that was that with Tom Bauer. And then more recently, he's just done a book about Meghan Markle, which is extremely good, and I was slightly involved with. Anyway, yeah, Tom is I don't know how you describe him. He's made a career out of doing a thoroughly forensic job on various people who needed a forensic job done on them.
Without their knowledge, generally.
Without their knowledge.
Yeah,
I just hope he never, I mean, I never want to be in the position of him having a go at me. He'd win, hands down.
Now, is it true you also published Madonna's book?
Yeah.
How did that come about?
You know, it's, in some industries, I imagine if you're in the oil industry or you're in the car industry, you have strategies and you work out what the business should do, where it should go. In our business, it's almost always pure luck. So one day I was in New York and visiting Warner Books, which was part of the Time Warner empire at the time, and just shooting talking to the bloke who ran the books bit, when his phone rang, and he said, sorry, I've been summoned by the boss of Time Warner, so I've got to go, but stay here, I won't be long. So he went off. He came back fuming, said that idiot has spent $25 million on a couple of records, a video and a book by this woman, Madonna. And I've been landed with 5 million of the 20 million, 25 million, just against the book. So it's going to wipe out my profit for the year. And I said, I don't know why I said it. So, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you 1 million of your 5 million for the non-US rights. And he said, well, that's a relief. So we did a deal. And so we didn't quite know what the book was about or what was going to be in it or anything, frankly, because she had total control. Eventually, we saw some proofs, and I took the proofs to Paul Hamlin because I thought he'd be interested. And he slowly turned the pages. The book was called Sex, incidentally. Turned the pages, and at the end of it, he said, well, I think very interesting, very interesting. But I didn't like the picture with the dog. And I said, well, it's too late. We can't take that picture of the dog. The book was £25, and this is in 1992, I think. So that would be like £50 today. We sold 180,000 on the first day outside North America. We reprinted 180,000 and they went out in a day. So, and then that was it, keep them begging. And this book is now one of the most highly prized items on the secondhand book market, fetches $1,000 a pop. And was enormous fun. When it came out, I wasn't actually in England. I'd been sent by my masters to Harvard Business School to polish me up a bit or something like that. And so I was in Boston, but I got invited to the launch party in New York, in the meat packing district, and I flew down and got a taxi from LaGuardia to this place. The taxi driver was very worried about going into this dodgy area, and indeed he wouldn't go all the way. He'd let me out a couple of blocks before, and I could see why, because I was in preppy gear, a little sports jacket and things. Everyone else was in leather and bondage and studs and on leads and I don't know what. It was one of the scariest nights of my life. But I did get to see Madonna's PR person and asked if it would be possible for Madonna to come and give a lecture at the Harvard Business School on marketing, because she clearly was a brilliant marketeer. And the PR person checked and said, well, it might be possible. When I got back to Harvard, I made this proposition to the dean, who went absolutely ballistic, said, how dare you? The very idea that Madonna would teach at the Harvard Business School is inconceivable. And anyway, the security would be too expensive. So they wouldn't have her. And it was a mistake. They should have had her. She was brilliant. And it was, I mean, I don't know, it's not a great book in literary terms, but it was certainly a great book in commercial terms.
And what about some of these other accidental successes that we mentioned right at the beginning?
Well, oh, there's so many. There was one I remember. I was in New York again, back in New York, and there was a book that had been in the #1 in the New York Times bestseller list for like 53 weeks or something. And when I went back to England, I said, I'd never heard of this book. Who's publishing it in England? And our guy said, oh yeah, we are. I said, we are? I'd never heard of it. Oh, we decided to change the title. Ah, I see. So the book was called Bridges of Madison County. And we had decided in our wisdom to conceal the fact that we had one of the best-selling books of the year by changing it to Love in Black and White. I had to write a letter to all the booksellers apologizing for this cock-up, and it then went on to sell a couple of million, so it was okay. Other sort of things, well, I don't know which one, you know, my brain's going soggy. I can't think. There were so many. Nearly
We can talk about
accident.
something else. You set up on your own eventually after,
yes,
you know, sort of many years of working with probably, well, certainly a sizable proportion of the greats in the great companies in the publishing world. How did that come about, and how does it compare to working for a large corporate?
Yeah. Well, how it came about was I got to the age of 70. I was on the main board of Bloomsbury Publishing, the Harry Potter publisher, as it's called. And, you know, you shouldn't. It's a PLC. It's you know, substantial business. And I had a lovely time. I had 12 years there, where we turned it from being a hit-driven business into being a much more secure, steady, stable, growing business. And its share price reflects that. It's in very good shape. But, you know, at 70, I'd done my bit, and I sort of felt that I'd done what I could do there. So I still work with them in various ways, but I stepped down from the main board. And I thought, well, I'm going to get bored. So why don't I start something? I've done, you know, I've worked in various companies in various things, but I've never put my own money in and become the owner. And so I opened an account, first thing you do is open an account, and I put £10,000 into the account. If I lost it, that was it. That was the end of it. And I had some ideas about how we could do things different and maybe better. My concern is that the bigger companies, however good they are, and they are good, it's very hard for an author to find who to talk to, because an author's worried about production, the editorial, the marketing, the sales, the royalties, the contracts, the copyrights, and they're all different departments, and it's very, very hard. So my thing is that Mensch publishing is meant to be Mensch. It's meant to be menschlich. It's upstanding, decent, but human, and therefore we make mistakes. So we're definitely imperfect. And that the authors know who they can ring up, because there isn't anyone else but me. And that if I could pull it off, I won't lose money. I won't make much money. This was not about making money. This was about experimenting, having happy authors, and seeing if we could do things a bit differently. Very, very often very trivial things differently, but trivial things matter. And so I set it up. We've now published 20-odd titles. I've got more than 10,000 still in the bank, which is a relief. But I think what you call key performance indicators, KPIs, the ones I use are not actually revenue or profit. They are, well, you've got to have those or you won't be in business, but that's secondary. The most important one is, are the authors happy? And the judgment on that is if they come back for another go, and they all have. So sometimes I didn't want them to, but they all have come back.
Wonderful.
And that seems to me a real test of success. It's bloody hard work. I'm learning. I thought I knew the business quite well, but the truth is I didn't. There are so many things I didn't understand. I'm still learning every day, which is pretty good. So I'm now 74, and you have to, it's a lot better than Sudoku for keeping your brain cells working, I think. And we published some really good books, and I'm very proud of them.
And this from a man who's made a lot of money from selling books of Sudoku.
Yeah, indeed. That was one of them. Absolutely. Should I tell that story, Jonathan?
Well, but by all means, yes, please do.
So it was one of the other. So when I was at Macmillan, we had a co-publishing venture with the Telegraph to do their puzzles, crossword puzzles, that sort of thing. And they came up with this new puzzle called Sudoku, which no one knew what the hell it was, but we took it on, and it started very, very quickly. We had no idea how well it was going to do. It was a joy because it's black and white, and one of the tricks was that there would be 100 puzzles, and then we would give the solutions, which meant another 100 pages. So you had 200 pages. So of course, no one's ever looked at the solution to a Sudoku puzzle, because you can either do it or you can't. But anyway, I then, when it was clear something was happening here, I rang up. We were owned by a German company, Verlagsgruppe Georg von Holtzbrink, who also owned Die Zeit, which is a very upmarket magazine in newspaper in Germany. And I rang up the editor saying, there's this thing called Sudoku, and I think it will be big in Germany as well as it is in the UK. He said, that's ridiculous. But he checked. And so Die Zeit became the first German newspaper to run Sudoku, so got themselves. Meanwhile, our Macmillan's American cousins, St. Martin's Press, decided that Sudoku was a really shit idea, and therefore they didn't want to take it on. So I sold the rights to another small American publisher who had its best year ever on the back of it. And then St. Martin's Press, realizing they made a mistake, did a deal with the New York Times. So we had the 2 best-selling Sudokus in America that year. So you couldn't write it. It would be fiction, all these stories, because it's pure luck, and there's nothing else to it but luck.
And I think you said the international distribution was also particularly easy because there was nothing to translate.
We even sold the Korean rights. I mean, why they paid us, I have no idea, but they did. Yeah, there is nothing to translate. It's a joy.
We have an audience question. Jay Pross says, Mensch Press is pretty exceptional in that it has no mission statement. How do you decide what books to accept for publication? How much does the market matter?
Okay. There are 3 characteristics of a book, it seems to me. That the first one is it should be good in itself. It should be a good book. And there are millions of good books, so that's not, but it should be good. The author should be good. More importantly than both of those is that the author should be someone you want to work with because you like them and they like you. That's a relationship thing, pure and simple. So as a result, I think Mensch Publishing has absolutely no consistency in its editorial. The market, if it is a good book and it is a good author and you do a good job, you will find a market. It may not be a very big market, but it will be a market. And the way I operate is that I keep my overheads to as close to 0 as possible, is me. And I don't pay advances to authors. I pay good royalties, and the royalties are a pure reflection of their success. So it becomes much more a partnership. And I have to say that the authors that I've published have been brilliant salespeople. They want their books to sell, and they, in nearly every case, they know their marketplace better than I could or anyone else could, because they're in it. So the decision is sort of both complex and simple at the same time. I don't do any sums. I don't do projections of what it will sell, because frankly, I haven't the faintest idea, nor does anyone else, and don't believe them if they say they do. And because of technology, and particularly digital technology, we're able to publish without taking risks on large print runs. You can print 1 book at a time, and it can work. Yeah, I don't really know the answer, but I think not having a mission, I mean, I put that in slightly tongue-in-cheek. There is a mission, but the mission is simply to do what Sir Stanley Unwin said, which is your first responsibility as a publisher is to stay in business so that you can pay the royalties. And I do take that very seriously. So the mission is to stay in business.
Now, you speak about your degree going back to the beginning and being in natural sciences, and that being unusual in that most of your colleagues had studied humanities. I wondered what advice you would give somebody now who wanted to pursue a career in publishing. Would that still be the case? Would that be helpful, or should they do something completely different?
Well, there is a vast oversupply of people wanting to be in publishing, and typically with humanities degrees. This sounds awful, but we could actually charge middle-class people with first-class degrees in English and history to come and work for us. We don't, but you could, and their parents would probably pay for a couple of years. So I mean, having a distinguishing characteristic is probably quite a good thing. And in my case, it was science, but it wasn't the science. How do I say this? Numeracy is important. And there was, at least at the beginning, and I think to some extent still, a feeling that publishing is sort of artistic, creative, and that numbers are what other people do. That's for the accountants. I'm not a great mathematician, I wouldn't claim to be, and I'm definitely not a great accountant, but I am sort of numerate. And basic numeracy matters enormously. And publishing is a business. It is a commerce. The creativity is the authors. They're the ones, and they're the ones one should respect. Just an aside, when I was an editor at OUP, we were not allowed to be thanked by the author in the book. The reason for this was that actually the editor is only one person. There are many people, the people in the post room who made sure that the proofs went out properly. There was someone in production who made sure the typesetting was good. There was someone, a sales rep in Hong Kong who made the sale. All these people could be thanked, and it's wrong to pick out on one or other person. So my advice to someone going into the business is don't think of it as a path to becoming a writer. Some people do, but think of it as a business in its own right. And the love of books, the love of writing is valuable. But in a way, you also have to hate books. Books in the warehouse are a terrible thing. You want to get rid of them as fast as you can. Yeah, loving books is good, but counting is even better, in my view.
Now, you've been a significant part of the publishing industry for more than 50 years, and you're Jewish, which might not be remarkable in itself, other than so many of the people you mention in the book who are also significant parts of the publishing industry happen to also be Jewish. And I wondered if you had a view why that might be the case.
Well, I think one thing is publishing is a low capital intensive industry. You don't have to, I mean, I started with £10,000, right? So that you don't have to have £1 million or 10 million pounds to start a publishing business. And if you're an immigrant, as my grandparents were, and I'm sure many Jewish people's grandparents, parents, or great-grandparents were, they arrive in the West, if you like, in the UK or the US, with little money, but a desire to be in business. And so people like Andre Deutsch, Paul Hand, George Weidenfeld, many, many others, Robert Maxwell, of course, came, and they went into publishing because they believe in culture, believe in literature, believe in education, and they could afford to do it. So a lot of people. I think it is something to do with, I'm not religious at all, but there's something about being able to read, to know the law is terribly important in Judaism. You must know the law. In order to know the law, you must be able to read. And in order to read, you get a sense of literature. And I think it permeates Jewish society at all sorts of levels. The strange thing is that despite the success of Jewish publishers, and I've only named a few, there are many, many more, there was during my career several elements of, I wouldn't go so far as to call it anti-Semitism, but a certain sense that that I wasn't quite part of the establishment, put it that way. And you live with it, you just get over it. But there were times when I could have got quite upset, but I didn't. That's the other thing.
Well, and a good thing too. It's been a real pleasure to chat to you this evening. If you want to buy this book, we will try and put a link on the follow-up email tomorrow, but it is widely available. Very interesting read, which genuinely gives an insight into a world that we all benefit from, but few of us know anything about. And to say thank you, I'm going to send you a book of some of my photographs.
You're fabulous.
Self-published, I'm afraid, but I don't think it suffers due to that. The next Millim will actually be in 3 weeks' time on the 14th of August. We've got the author Paul A. Mendelsohn joining to discuss his latest novel, The Forever Moment. To be sure you find out about all of our events, both live and online, please visit millim.org.uk and sign up to our newsletter. All of our online events are free. We do charge for the live ones, but you can make a donation if you like to help with our costs. There is a link in the chat now, or visit our website for details. It remains for me to thank our guest, Richard Charkin, once again. Thank you so much, Richard. It's been really fascinating to talk to you.
My pleasure.
And until next time, stay safe. See you soon.
Cheers.